Hey, Raquel. Tommy Gibbons here, professor of the course. Great to have you in the course. Welcome. And I thought I'd get us started with a video reply because that gives me a chance to kind of say hello a little more directly, welcome you, and give you some of my reaction to what you've written in week one, which is superb, by the way. So well done on your work in week one. And before I go any further, congratulations on getting to like the second to last quarter of your MDiv. I know that's a long journey, especially if you've been doing most or all of that online. So anyway, glad that we're finally getting a chance to work together. And I think I'll just move right into giving you some reaction to what I have read in what you've said in both forums. First of all, I think I just wanted to highlight something that you've said in Forum 1 about who Israel is that is easy to forget as we read Matthew with some of the assumptions that Christians often bring to Matthew. And that is that, as you say, Israel from the very beginning is called as one people among others, and called to be a priestly people that is in relation to those other peoples of the world and is shaped to be a blessing finally for all the peoples of the world. That's the promise that is given to Abraham that sort of governs the whole history of Israel. And so you've talked about that uh, in relation to Genesis yourself, with how the whole earth would be blessed. And I think that is important because sometimes people read Matthew as if Jesus had to teach his generation or the authorities of his generation that. And I don't think that he did. I think that even the people to whom Jesus is opposed in Matthew, some of the authorities, for example, they have embraced this message of Genesis as their calling. They understand Israel to be called to be a blessing to all the peoples of the world. But how Israel is that blessing, how it cultivates that sort of life, that is what Jesus is clashing with certain authorities over in the context of Matthew. And so that might be something for us just to keep in mind as we're reading the story together. You talked about your kind of sense as you were reading it of the prophetic sort of force of this narrative, which I think is exactly right. And you're picking up on that refrain that punctuates the opening scenes of the gospel, that this or that happened so that what was spoken by the word of the prophet was fulfilled. And so fulfillment, the way that Israel's memory and hope are filled out in a particular way by Jesus, is a really key concern of this narrative. And you can probably imagine that um, these claims are not sort of straightforward. It's not as if everybody was reading Hosea 11 about God calling God's son from Egypt, describing Israel as God's son there, as some kind of prophecy of the Messiah. Instead, what Matthew has done is to discern in a text that celebrated a certain memory of Israel something that is pregnant with a future that the Messiah has come to embody. So Jesus is not like just a Lego piece, right? That is being fit into nice little slots in Old Testament texts or prophets or whatever. Those words themselves of the law, the prophets, the writings are alive. They are pregnant with all kinds of possibility that is the subject of ongoing debate, discernment. It is affected by the actual course of different communities' lives in the people of Israel. And so our narrative is sort of participating in what is really a conversation with the living words of Scripture in light of how Jesus's life, and especially really the life of his whole generation in the Promised Land, has unfolded. So that was just a good, I think, catch that you have about something that kind of characterizes this story, and that points up our need to kind of think about what it means for it to be prophetic. And that brings me to another dimension of what you've highlighted here. In both posts, you pick up on this kind of structure of the prophets and of Matthew as well, that the prophets speak, even the biblical narratives speak. Matthew speaks sort of in view of a certain horizon on that day, as you say, is the phrase. In, seminary speak, we might say there's this eschatological horizon to these stories, and that includes Matthew. And so here's where I want to offer something that will probably be just something to think about throughout the course. What is, that day that is on the horizon of Matthew? Arguably, Matthew is saying that that day that was on the horizon of the prophets, narratives of Israel's past as well, has dawned. It has come. It is the day of the Lord. That's effectively how he presents the announcement of John the Baptist as sort of the call of Elijah who was to come, as Malachi had prophesied, who is preparing Israel for the great and terrible day of the Lord. And of course, the day of the Lord, as it is unfolding, is not some kind of easy match, right, to anybody's expectations. And so what that day has turned out to be like is itself part of the drama, the tension of Matthew. And just to kind of turn the screw a little bit more here, this is true of the horizon of Matthew itself. As you've noted, Jesus is talking about an approaching storm, a day of judgment that is coming. And Christians today have often sort of inherited an intuition about that kind of language, that it must always be basically about the end of the world, the end of human history, the second coming of Christ. These are some of the terms that we use for that day that we find in the New Testament and in Matthew specifically. And what I want to point out at this early stage is that if we follow the arc of the narrative, that's not actually how it tells us that day unfolds. Jesus is talking about a storm that will come to his generation, come to Jerusalem within his generation. Before it passes away, he says explicitly in Matthew 24. And so some of the language that we have associated with a, end of time judgment, or second coming of Christ in Matthew, I don't think actually fits that very well if we pay attention to how this language actually unfolds in the arc of Matthew's narrative itself, and how Jesus himself describes these events. And so we find ourselves experiencing maybe something of what people were as they were hearing John and then Jesus talk about the day of the Lord having dawned, the kingdom of heaven having come, and sort of like, yeah, I can kind of see that, but like all kinds of noise too, dissonance about whether or not this is what we had imagined. And I think that's going to be true for us as well, whether or not how Matthew actually presents the fulfillment of this language about this horizon fits what we have imagined that language to mean. And that's going to have all kinds of sort of domino effects in terms of how we think Matthew is speaking to our present, how it might or might not be speaking to our future, what it says about the presence and ruling power of the risen Jesus now, already, since the horizon of a judgment day that Jesus is describing early in Matthew, according to Matthew, unfolded especially in the fall of Jesus, his crucifixion, and then the fall of Jerusalem and the temple within his generation, and then the rise of Jesus from among the dead and the rise of his people from the ashes of that terrible judgment and destruction that they endured at the end of his generation. So anyway, you can imagine how this is going to hopefully cause us to puzzle a little bit over this language of that day, that horizon in Matthew, and to try to read the narrative as carefully as we can, and maybe at least question that conclusion that we've often jumped to, that that language is always about what we now conceive of as the end of time or the second coming of Christ or something along those lines. So more to come, obviously, in the class about that. But since you were mentioning this phrase on that day in your post, I thought I would speak to that now. Again, welcome to the course, and thanks for some really good, I think, careful reading of both the biblical text and the secondary sources and some thoughtful responses. Thanks for your work.